I love Jesus. I really do. But I didn't always love him. I didn't always understand him. I didn't understand also how much Jesus loves me. You see, I was brought up in a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, the island of Malta, which is a beautiful, stunning island. When I was brought up with a family that was loving, caring, of course, but also had its imperfections. My dad, for example, was so strict, always strict with me, to the point where I could never do anything right. He always wanted me to be better, and rightly so, but the way he communicated it to me made me feel like I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't strong enough, that I wasn't successful enough. I remember one time going up to my parents and they're showing my dad my school report, and he'd look at my report and say, "This is so good, you've passed all your exams, but I'm sure you're going to fail." Now, I was so upset because why would my dad tell me that he's sure I'm going to fail? Well, the message he wanted to give me was, "Rob, if you don't keep studying, if you don't keep working, you're going to fail." But the message I kept getting was, no matter how hard you try, you're going to fail. So I started to rebel against my parents, rebel against family. I didn't want to spend time with my family, 14 years old. Now, being brought up on the island of Malta, Malta is famous for a couple of things. One of the things it's famous for is its religion. We have so much religion in Malta, as you do in Rome, as you do in a lot of Europe. But also the second thing that we're famous for is its partying. The drinking, alcohol drinking age in Malta is 16. We have places where there are hundreds of nightclubs door to door. And I used to see these young people going to these clubs, and my friends started going to the clubs, and I started to tell my parents, "Mom, Dad, I want to go to the club." I know I was young, but I had had enough of being at home, and I wanted to spend more time with my friends. So my parents let me go out. They said, "Okay, you can go, but you have to be home by 8:30. Now, that upset me because 8:30 was the time the nerds went home. Well, everyone else went home at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And so I told my parents, "Mom, Dad, I'm not going to go out. I'm going to wait, and then I'll go out when I'm a bit older." But I did wait, but only just a couple of hours, waited for my parents to sleep, and I jumped out of the window, and I went to the clubs. Now, I snuck out, and I snuck into the clubs, and obviously the people there, I'm 14 years old, were much older than I was, but everyone there was seemingly happy to see me. And they would serve me drinks, and eventually I became addicted to the drinking. I would gain so much confidence when people handed me drinks. And this became an addiction for me because I loved the confidence. I loved the way I felt when I drank. And so every weekend I'd go out and I'd drink. And I got a lot of attention for drinking. It wasn't only the fact that I was drinking, but it was the attention I was getting for drinking. This 14-year-old going into the clubs, drinking, and people surrounded me, and they wanted to be around me. And I loved it. I loved the attention. But eventually, the attention started to move away from me to other people, other 14, 15-year-olds who were coming to the club. And so I wanted and needed to do something to gain more attention. So I started smoking, and from smoking, eventually everyone else was smoking, so I started taking drugs, and from drugs I started to take heavier drugs, and eventually, you see, I was getting a lot of attention for it, but without me knowing, my life was starting to spin out of control. I got into habits of stealing, going into shops, stealing stuff. That too became an addiction, where I couldn't even see my parents' things, my mother's handbag, without stealing something. I couldn't go into a store without stealing something. I had an addictive personality. And with the substance that I was taking, with the anger and rebellion that I had a life that was spinning out of control. And I didn't know what to do. What am I going to do? And eventually I was in a store, a bicycle store, and I go into this shop and with a group of friends, and I steal the first thing that I could find, a very expensive piece of computer, like software, hardware. And as I went out of the store, I put the computer in my backpack and I cycled out. I stole the stuff, but there were my friends with me. And they were cycling after me. And I'm thinking, this is so awesome. I've stolen something, and my friends are going to really have fun with this, because we're going to sell this stuff and we're going to party for weeks. But my best friend caught up with me on his bicycle and kicked me off mine. And he started to punch me and kick me and say, "You idiot. Every time we're near you, we have to watch our back." So they decided not to hang out with me anymore. Now, this was a problem because, you see, a few years back, I was 15 years old. A year and a half before that, I had run away from home. And so now I had no place to lay my head. I was homeless and I didn't know what to do. So the only thing I knew to do was to go back to that nightclub area. And that's where Chris and his friends used to hang out. Chris was much older than I was. He was the drug dealer. He was the one who would start fights and make sure that people paid. He was someone to be reckoned with, someone not to mess around with. But I needed friends, so I go up to Chris and I say, "Chris, I just want to hang out with you." Now, Chris used to get into fights and beat people up. He was horrible in many ways. But I needed friends, so I started to hang out with him and his friends. And one day, I'm sitting outside a nightclub, 15 years old, and there's this 30-year-old that was walking out of the clubs. And as he walks out of the clubs, I'm seeing him wear a cap, a really cool cap. And I go up to Chris, I say, "Chris, look at this guy's cap, it's so cool." And he pushes me and he says, "Rob, go and take it." And I'm saying, "Chris, how am I going to take this cap? This guy is so much older than I am, so much bigger than I am. There's no way I'm going to get away with it." But you see, I wanted Chris's respect. I wanted Chris to like me. I wanted Chris to respect me. So I jumped down and I walked towards this 30-year-old and I grabbed his cap and I put it on my head, waiting for him to turn around and to pull it off and maybe punch me in the face, which I didn't care if he punched me in the face, because at least I had the respect of Chris. And so I waited for him to take my cap off me, but nothing happened. So I turn around, and when I turn around, I see this guy on the floor. I see him being beaten up by 11 of Chris's friends. Now, this was absolutely incredible for me to witness, because it was incredible not because it was an incredible sight, but simply because I couldn't believe that these guys would do so much to protect me. Now, that's what I thought, you see, because this guy reached to take the cap from me, but even before he could do that, these guys jumped on him, started to beat him up. But they started to beat him up so badly that he started to bleed and eventually passed out. Every time he woke up, he would beg for his life, but they continued to punch him. They continued to kick him. They continued to beat him up. And when this guy was unconscious on the floor, bleeding to death, I remember standing over his body, his lifeless body, thinking, wow, I have so much respect. I have so much attention. And I loved it. But this was so crazy because, you see, a few years back, I had won a prize at school for the most kind-hearted student in my entire elementary, in my entire primary school. And now I was beating people to death and I didn't even care about it. Why? Because I was desperate for love. I was desperate for the love of God, which I didn't even know I needed. And so I continued to hang out with Chris and his friends, but you see, it became less and less appealing to me because my life started to get worse and worse and worse. And one day I'm 16 years old in a nightclub, sitting in a nightclub, and a group of friends come up to me and run up to me and say, quickly get out of here because Chris is looking for you. And I'm terrified. So I get up and I run home. And I knock at my parents' home and I say, Mom, Dad, you have to hide me because Chris is looking for me to kill me. Now, I know that when Chris is looking for someone, he does a lot of damage. He didn't find me, he found my best friend. And what he did was he got his head and he smashed it against the wall and broke his skull. Now, these guys are looking for me and I'm terrified. Locked in my room for 8 weeks. And the 8 weeks turned to 10 weeks. And I just couldn't leave because I was terrified and scared. Every now and then, my parents would knock at my door. They'd say, Rob, are you okay? that hear me crying, that hear me in pain, that hear me on my knees, just wishing for my life to end because I was desperate. I was hopeless. And they'd knock at the door, and every time I'd slam the door in their face, I'd say, Mom, Dad, you leave me alone. You know, a few years later, I wrote a book called Breakthrough. Now, this book is published by Ave Maria Press and is actually being made into a Hollywood movie soon. But before I published this book, I gave the chapter to my mom. I said, Mom, Dad, I want you to read this chapter because this is the part of my life that involves you so closely. This was the moment when I was locked in my room. And I was on my knees and I would rock on my bed. I wrote this in the chapter, that how I wish, and I wrote this as a priest. I said, how I wish that my parents didn't just knock at the door, but I wish that they came and they broke down the door and they held me and they hugged me and they told me that I was going to be okay, because I needed to be told that I was going to be okay, because I didn't know it. I didn't know I was going to survive another day. So I said, Mom, Dad, read this, and how I wish you did more. And so they call me the next week, and my mom is crying. And I said, Mom, why are you crying? She says, Rob, because there's something that you don't know. And that is, you see, we'd knock at your door. And every time we knocked at the door, we would ask if we could come in and talk to you, but you'd slam the door in our face. But according to your book, you went to your knees and you would rock on your bed and harm yourself and hit your head against the wall and want this pain to go away. You'd be on your knees in desperation. But what you do not know is that every time you slammed that door, your dad and I, we didn't walk away. We didn't run away. We fell to our knees outside your room and we prayed for you. We prayed for our little angel. I stand here as a priest. I'm alive and able to serve others and have a desperation to reach out to people because my parents never gave up on me. You see, they saw me in my desperation, but they continued to pray for me, even though I continued to get worse. And as they continued to pray for me, to reach out to me, I didn't get better, I got worse. But eventually, a little miracle happened, and I get invited to a charismatic youth group. Now, I didn't know what to do because I was scared of Chris, but I took the risk and I went out, and I hung out with this youth group. Now, these young people were so full of joy and life, and I didn't know what was going on. In fact, I hated being there because everyone was so joyful and happy. But I was desperate for love. I was desperate for what they had. I wanted what they had. And so I kept going. And one day, something happened that changed my life forever. One day while I was sitting there in this youth group, this medical doctor stood up and started preaching. He started to talk about Jesus. Now, I don't remember what he said about Jesus, but I do remember the way he said it. He talked about Jesus as though he had coffee with him that morning. Now, I believed that God existed, but I didn't know that we could have this relationship with God. And so I go back to my room that night, and I put a chair in front of me, and I tap the chair in front of me. I say, Jesus, sit down. I want to talk to you. I want to know you like that doctor in that charismatic group knows you. And so I sat down, and I didn't feel a thing. I didn't sense a thing. But you know what? The next day I woke up, and this sense of peace followed me like I had never had before. And so the next day I sat down and I prayed again. And that peace followed after the time of prayer. Again, I didn't feel anything during the prayer, but the peace that followed, the hope that followed, that I was so desperate for started to grow and grow. I kept going to the youth group and eventually discovered the most important treasure of my life, and that is my relationship with Jesus. Now, I don't have time to explain much more detail, but you know what? I began this relationship with Jesus. I began to speak to him, and I began to listen to him. And as I began to listen to him, I began to fall in love with him. But this love didn't end in a love between me and God. It ended up with a desperation to reach out to others, to tell the world about what I was experiencing. And that's what I have been doing for the last 30 years, 20 years. Actually, I'm not making myself older than I actually am. For the last 20 years, I've been just speaking about Jesus. I love Jesus with all of my heart. I'm not worthy of his love, but I will do anything to proclaim him, to point to him, because he has changed my life. And if he has done this for me, I know he can do even bigger and greater things for you. Please pray for me. God bless you, and let his face shine upon you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And here's the song, Angel. This is a song I wrote, which talks about the prayer that my parents prayed when they were outside my room praying for me.
You are more than I hoped for, and my heart is overwhelmed by the beauty of all that you are now, and my life is changed forever. So I pray that you will be happy, that your smile will last forever, and God's light will shine within you, my little angel. Let him dance over you, and let him sing a song so true, and let his face shine bright on you and lead you to a place called home, a home for you, my little angel. For all that may lie ahead now, as life serves its joys and sorrows, and I pray that you will hold on to the love that's never ending. So I pray that you will be happy, that your smile will last forever, and God's light will shine within you, my little angel. And let him dance over you, let him sing a song so true, let his face shine bright on you and lead you to a place called home, a home for you, my little angel. Let him dance over you, let him sing a song so true, let his face shine bright on you and lead you to a place called home, a home for you, my little angel.